bump. Tom's heart began to race. What was that sound? He lay in his bed, trying to be perfectly silent, holding his breath so as not to make a sound. He was carefully listening for whatever had just made that sound. It is a well-established fact that all houses at night have the same phenomenon. This is called bumps in the night. If the house is incredibly old or impeccably new, the same phenomenon will occur. Some people would put this down to ghostly activity, but even people with the most open minds would tell you that it was simply the house expanding or contracting to the temperature. However, some folk would use this to their advantage and sneak into a house at night to relieve its occupants of their possessions. All of these things could be possible, but the temperature theory was most likely. If this was the case, then all would be well and Tom could return to sleep. If it were to happen again, he probably wouldn't even notice it. However, he had only just begun to settle himself down for the night when this happened. Anyone who hears a bump in the night will automatically become aware of a potential dangerous situation. This is perfectly normal, and right now Tom was listening out to make sure that all was well so he could return to sleep. He listened. Most people would have given up and gone back to sleep by now, but Tom was slightly paranoid and would not rest until he was satisfied nothing else was going on. In his mind, his thoughts constantly wrestled with what the noise could be. Was it just the worktop in the kitchen? No, it definitely sounded as if someone was walking. These two thoughts kept fighting it out in Tom's mind. Eventually, after a few minutes, Tom decided that it was just the house settling, and if there was someone downstairs, he could play ignorance towards it, even though he'd probably be in serious danger if it were true. He turned over and closed his eyes, hoping to get off to sleep. Then he heard it. He instantly turned onto his back and held his breath and listened. The exact same thought process began to fly around his mind. Was it a coincidence he had heard this sound twice? This time, he came to the unsatisfying conclusion that there was indeed something very wrong occurring, and he instantly decided to take action against it. He sat up in bed and listened out for any more sounds. He stared out of the doorway and onto the landing. He could just about make out the top of the stairs. There was always something unsettling about the view from his bedroom. Looking down at the banister, his imagination would always dream up the possibility of a face jumping up in the gap and staring at him. The incredibly remote chances of this even happening didn't stop him from still being slightly scared about it. Listening out for another bump, Tom sat in silence. His young ears could only pick up a faint high-pitched whine coming from a main socket. Apart from that, the house was filled with a deafening silence. Not even his housemate Jonathan in the next room was making any sound. Despite hearing nothing, Tom was still unnerved. His imagination was now throwing up possibilities of the impossible. That was it. The time had come to make a brave attempt to investigate. Tom quietly lifted the duvet up and shuffled out of the bed. He reached out and picked up his pyjama top that he had left lying on a stool. One thing was for certain. Whatever was hopefully not down there wasn't going to catch him without a shirt on. He tiptoed across the room to the door. On the landing, he was making every attempt to be as quiet as possible, partially as not to wake Jonathan, and most importantly, to not let anything downstairs know that he was coming. Now came the tricky part. The house wasn't incredibly old, but the staircase could be considered ancient, as each step had a distinct creak. Tom knew this, and decided to become as light as a feather and tread very carefully on the edges of the steps. This was of course a waste of time, as the steps still creaked under his feet anyway. That aside, he had made it to the bottom and he was now downstairs. He turned to look down the hallway. The short hallway now stretched off into the ether. Carefully running his hand along the wall, he eventually came to the kitchen door. He had passed the front and back rooms, but he was certain that the noise had come from the kitchen. He didn't think about the fact that the door to the kitchen was closed. He always closed it at night. Carefully opening the door, Trying not to look into the abyss, he ran his hand up and down the wall, trying to find the light switch that always seemed to move. After switching the light on, it was now safe to look into the kitchen. There he found nothing. He decided to step into the kitchen and check to make sure that everything was sound. It was, but he couldn't help but feel around the edges of the worktops to make absolutely sure that nothing was amiss. Everything was fine. He turned and began to leave the room. Finding the light switch with one hand and the doorknob in the other, he took one last glance around before turning his back and switching the light off. Pulling the door to, he was about to make his way back to bed when suddenly he heard a thump. He recognised this sound. It wasn't any sound the house would make naturally. This was the distinct sound of something hitting the window. He instantly turned around and opened the door and switched on the light again. He made his way over to the window, peering out into the darkness of the garden. What could have made this sound? He knew that whatever had struck the window must have been outside. Clearly, whatever it was, it must have been very small, as the security light wasn't on. Unable to see anything, Tom cleared every possibility of hearing any noise from his mind and began to once again make his way back up to bed. This is when it began. At first, he heard nothing. He was once again making his way out of the kitchen and switching the light off. He hadn't noticed the sound of cutlery rattling away in the drawer. When it finally dawned on him, he froze into place. A cold chill ran up his spine, and the hairs on his arms stood up. He turned to face the cutlery drawer. He looked with an expression of pure terror on his face. It was as if the drawer was open and someone was fiddling around trying to find a piece of cutlery. But how was this happening? Although Tom was a very sensibly minded person, he could not help his imagination running wild as to what was causing the noise. Was it even coming from the drawer? Was his mind just playing tricks on him? He decided he was brave enough to find out. He stepped away from the door and carefully placed his hand on the drawer's handle. Deep down, he wanted there to be a justifiable explanation for this. Pulling the drawer, he found it was stuck. Not stuck as in something wedged inside preventing it from opening, but stuck as if someone had glued it shut. He tugged at the drawer, but it refused to budge. Now using both hands, he stooped down slightly to put all his strength into opening the drawer. It took all his strength when suddenly the drawer broke free. Tom went flying backwards as he violently pulled the drawer away. The cutlery rattled and the drawer cracked as he fell onto the kitchen floor. He quickly picked himself up and looked in horror. Not only had he broken the drawer, he had made one hell of a noise in doing so. He knew by now he must have woken his housemate. Knowing that it was only a matter of time before he came down, he decided to inspect the damage done to the drawer. The drawer was now fully extended out into the kitchen. It drooped down at an angle. He lifted the drawer up in an attempt to push it back in. Broken, he thought. He felt around the edges of the drawer to see if it had been glued shut. Not only did he not find any evidence of glue, but he also thought about why anyone would do such a thing. He continued to check the drawer for some time. He wanted to remain in the moment until Jonathan came down. Some time passed, and there was no sign of him. Tom didn't know Jonathan as a heavy sleeper, but he assumed that he hadn't heard anything. He decided to sort out the contents of the drawer and return to bed. After doing so, he left the drawer as it was, sticking out and slightly askew, and hoping that it wouldn't fall during the night and make an even louder noise that he would have to explain. Turning the light off, he closed the drawer and quietly made his way along the dark hall. As he made his way towards the staircase, he constantly thought about the incident in the kitchen. He ran it through his mind so many times that it almost felt like ancient history as he was passing the front room. But then something caught his attention. As he had made his first step on the creaky staircase, a very peculiar noise had caught his attention. It could only be described as someone flicking through a book. He stood with one foot on the step and listened again. He experienced another chill down his spine as he heard the flicking sound again. He had placed the direction of the sound as coming from the front room. Unfazed, after the incident in the kitchen, he decided to investigate. Stepping into the front room, he looked around for the source of the sound. He didn't need to switch on the light as the light from a street lamp outside shone into the room. His eyes almost instantly fell upon a book resting on the table in the middle of the room. He recognised this book, of course. It was part of his studies. He had almost forgotten about the noise by now and decided to pick up the book and return it to its place on the shelf. For 2 university students, the bookshelf was surprisingly full. However, most of the books on the shelf belonged to the landlord, or rather, belonged to students of days gone by that had been left there and fell into the ownership of the landlord. Nevertheless, he made quite a collection over the years and kept them there for students to use. Tom and Jonathan liked to keep their books out of the way when they weren't studying. The fact that this book hadn't been put away was down to Tom leaving it out. He knew this as he had been reading the book moments before turning in for the night. However, he now thought it to be the appropriate time to return it. With the book returned to the shelf, Tom was now about ready to actually go to bed and off to sleep. Turning his back on the bookcase, he headed for the hallway. He stopped when he heard the distinct thud of a book hitting the floor. He turned. He scanned his way down the bookshelf until his eyes hit the floor. There, he found a book lying there. He quickly kneeled down to pick it up. Glancing at the cover, he didn't recognise it as one of theirs. However, he didn't have time to think about it, as suddenly something sharp struck him on his back, right between the shoulder blades. Holding his back in pain, he glanced down to find another book lying on the floor. It was a hardback. This would explain why it hurt so much. This is when it finally dawned on him. Something really strange was going on. He took a few steps back away from the bookshelf, carefully watching each shelf to see if any more books decided to fall. For a moment, everything seemed still. He began to think nothing more of it. Then suddenly, one book pulled itself right out in front of him. Another hardback. It landed on the floor with a thud. This couldn't be happening, he thought to himself. Then, a thin magazine that was resting on the top of some books flew out and landed on the floor with a splat. Tom was beginning to freak out. 4 books had now fallen out. His mind searched for a logical explanation, but he failed to find one. He decided to leave the room. Stepping out backwards into the hall, Tom pulled the door shut. He instantly let go of the handle as he felt it moving in his grasp. He didn't dare look at it moving by itself. He circled round towards the stairs and made his way up. Once he had made it into his room, he quickly turned to face the door. He tried to control his breathing so he could listen out for any sounds. Then his nightmares came true. It started off quietly at first, but he could make out the distinct sound of something making its way up the stairs. He looked down at the banister, expecting to see something pop up from downstairs. The unseen footsteps continued towards the top of the stairs, but he saw nothing. Surely, by now whatever was coming up the stairs would be seen. But Tom saw nothing. He stood alone in his room, petrified as unseen movement began shuffling along the landing and into his room. He wanted to cry out so desperately for help, but whatever had entered his room had him under some kind of spell that refused him to take action. He felt so cold yet sweaty at the same time, his heart racing as the feeling of dread swept around him. He felt incredibly intimidated by whatever was harassing him. But as his feelings swelled up in sheer terror, something happened. He let out an incredibly deep breath. He was suddenly able to move again. Whatever had a hold of him had vanished and gone. Despite this, he found himself shaking. Whatever had happened had left him incredibly unnerved. He found his way into bed and lay there for a few seconds before pulling up the duvet. He wasn't sure if he was safe. If anything, he was afraid of falling asleep. But fall asleep he did. It may have taken an hour or 2, but for what felt like the rest of the night he lay awake with his eyes fixed onto the staircase, just in case something returned.